Okay, so now we're in process of removing the rear axle from the car. We've lifted the car up. I'm doing this obviously on my driveway, and safety first, of course. Make sure you're using axle stands whatever you do. So the axle stands are on, car is up in the air. Let's have a look at the underbody of the car. So I've already taken the exhaust off, and the anti-roll bar was already powder coated about a year ago or so. So that's just going to get transferred onto the new rear axle. I'd also replace the exhaust mounting points, the exhaust brackets, and the exhaust hanger bushes. And most people actually fit these wrong way around, so whatever you do, don't fit them this way. They have to go that way, and they clamp like that. So another tip for you there. This heat shield will need to be replaced or repaired. There's corrosion all over the attachment points, and it's barely hanging on there. But as far as the body of the car is concerned, it's actually in really good condition. Obviously the control arms and the subframe and the diff itself are quite rusty, but the body itself doesn't have any corrosion on there whatsoever. So I plan to have it under-sealed eventually, but that will be done over the winter once the paintwork is being done. So let's have a look what we have here. This is currently a small case diff setup, so 166 or 168 case, and that's the original diff that came with the car. So the car started its life as a 318 IS, and this is the rear axle that came with it. And as far as I know, it's never been off the car. So it's done alright in its 24-year life, I think, to make it this far, and surprisingly there isn't even a single leak on the diff. But anyway, all of that's coming off now. So yeah. And just briefly to touch on the rear brake setup. So I've done the conversion to the post 98 line setup, so you've got a single line running through this new post 98 bracket, running straight onto the hard pipe that just comes off the body. I replaced these hard pipes with conifer pipes back in 2017 when I decided to put the car back on the road, and the brake pipes were completely rotten, so I'd replaced them a little while ago, and these are still in good condition. They're holding up well. We'll also have to change the drive shafts and the rear section of the prop shaft, where we're going from a small case diff to the medium case diff. The drive shaft lengths are different and the thicknesses are different, and so is the prop shaft. And here you have this mass damper that I was mentioning, and the bush is still in there, so it's just a big weight attached to the rear axle. Here you have the heat shield brackets that I mentioned in part 1 that I got from BMW, and this is twisted and rusted and that needs replacing 100%. And this one here is not too bad, but we might as well replace the other. Might replace this one since we're replacing the other side. Just have a look at the whole setup on this side as well, just like that. And since it's the old style trailing arm, the pre-98, it still has 2 attachment points, so one there and one there. And you see the bracket doesn't need that one there, it just needs a little pocket there, which the new style trailing arms have, so this bracket will fit perfectly onto the new setup. Just having a look at the jacking points. Again, the body of the car is absolutely perfect for its age, really. There's a little bit of underseal that's starting to come off the body, but there's actually no rust on the car whatsoever. Once we re-underseal the underbody, we'll either replace the tank straps or we'll re-powder coat them. Okay, so the rear axle is now on the floor. It was surprisingly easy to get this particular one off. I was expecting for the bolts to be seized and corroded and all sorts of things, but this one came off very easily. No issues with it whatsoever. I've had a quick look around it, and it doesn't actually look to be in terrible condition. The bushes are still quite good. I mean, you can see the rubber starting to separate from the cores on the front and on the back bushes. The upper ball joints look okay. There's no play in them. The
the lower bushes on there, they also look okay. Just having a look in here, and as I mentioned in part 1 about the orientation of these upper control arms, the longer rib of the control arm goes towards the rear of the car, and the bigger section of the bush goes towards the rear of the car as well, so make sure you bear that in mind. I've taken this off with the prop completely, since we're going to be replacing the rear section of the prop, so this section here, and I've just lowered it onto the jack once everything was disconnected, and it just dropped right down. We'll be keeping the anti-roll bar as I mentioned earlier, so anti-roll bar with its bushes, which already polyurethane, will be transferred along with the drop links, but we are just going to replace the drop link bushings with the polyurethane ones that we've got, because you can see they're cracked and they're starting to go. We'll also be transferring the wheel speed sensors. This one was actually replaced recently. We'll be transferring the brake discs, the handbrake shoes assembly, the carriers, the wheel studs onto the other hubs, and we'll be transferring these polyurethane bushes. So they'll be staying. The little boxes that house the plugs for the wheel speed sensors and wear sensors, they'll be staying as well. The spring seats will be cleaned up and reused as well, and that's about it. Now we have the upper and lower control arms assembled onto the diff carrier, and the bushes are assembled in there. So just a little tip when assembling these, take them apart when they're out, insert the polyurethane part first with grease on the outside and on the inside, top half, bottom half, and then press the core in, because when you press the core in, obviously the bush expands, so you can't actually get them in while the core is in the bush. Well, you can, but it's just very difficult. So that's that there. We've checked the orientation of the upper control arms and everything is correct. The same goes for the front. Another thing that I was quite impressed with this front bush is that it's got the little step there to compensate for the little step in the diff carrier. And I think that's a very nice and neat feature, because that just ensures it fits perfectly. And it's got this little recess here, and that's for the stud nut to sit in. So for that nut that's welded onto the stud, that's going to sit inside this recess here. So I've already torqued the upper bolts because the core and the polyurethane bush are not molded together, so there's a freedom of movement there. But with the lower control arms, they've still got rubber bushes in them. That's how they came, and you can't actually torque these until the car is on the floor, otherwise you'll start twisting the rubber bush. So the lower ones are not torqued yet, and they'll be torqued afterwards, but the upper ones are torqued already. So now I'm going to get this onto the car, and after that the prop shaft can go in, and then the diff, then the drive shafts, and then hopefully the trailing arms. So let's go. So a little bit more progress. The diff carrier with the arms is now on with the new plates, and it's all torqued. The new exhaust heat shield brackets are on with the grommets from the old ones, so we've transferred them across, so they're on. The prop shaft is not on. So yeah, next up is the diff. I've also did a quick repair on the rear muffler heat shield, so I've just used these oversized washers for the time being, but it will be replaced once the underbody gets addressed next year. And the diff is in, so it's fully bolted in and attached. We've also replaced the prop shaft because the medium case
differential prop shaft is slightly shorter, because the differential is bigger, so the prop shaft has to be shorter than what we had on the car with the small case setup. So that's all on. I've also gone and replaced the prop shaft centre bearing. I used a Melee HD one, and since I thought I was going to be replacing the prop, I thought it's a good idea to replace the bearing as well. We've also installed the little boxes to hold the wiring harnesses. That's gone back on. All the little clips for the brake pad wear sensor and for the wheel speed sensor are also installed, and the diff is in and torqued. One thing to mention when installing the diff, what you should really do is you should make sure that the threads inside here are completely debris free from debris. And so what I actually did, I actually took a tap and ran it down into each of the threaded holes, just to make sure that I clean it from any potential debris or any leftover powder coat or anything like that, just to ensure that I don't cross thread the bolts as I'm installing them. So just watch out for that. If you have any overspray inside where the thread is, just make sure you clean it up. The differential front bush has also been replaced, and it's strong flex again. It comes with this washer, that's an absolute must. So the bush slides in from this side, then you put the core in, then you put this washer on, and then you actually bolt the front end of the diff. One of the reasons why I actually decided to go with a medium case diff setup is I personally find that the medium case rear ends are a lot more reliable than the large case on the M3 Evo. They're also a little bit cheaper than the large case setups, because the M3 rear axles, the 3.2 Evo rear axles, are very expensive, especially in 2020, 2021. So this is a much more cost-effective solution, and they don't suffer with the same issues as the large case rear ends. So the large case rear ends have got like a boomerang brace at the back of the differential that always likes to snap, and the front attachment point. So this one is sort of part of the subframe, where on the large case diff carrier it's slightly out and it always cracks around this area here, where the medium case rear ends practically have no issues with them whatsoever if they're built properly and they're looked after. Now moving on to assembly of the trailing arms and putting everything back together. So what I used is this tap and die set, and I cleared up every single threaded hole that I had. So this one here is for the bracket that secures the brake hoses. Then you've got this hole here, which is for the wheel speed sensor, and I've also sanded it down just so you get to the bare metal to make sure that the sensor is actually sitting exactly where it needs to sit. And then you've got the shock absorber attachment points. I've cleaned them all up as well. And then I went on to press in the ball joints. So it's the upper one and the lower one. And then you've got the wheel bearing inside there, and this is the hub. And these are the polyurethane Powerflex bushes that were already on the car on the old set of arms, which I transferred across. And I have fitted the bracket that attaches the trailing arm to the body of the car. Now, this here is what I used to put the bearing in. So obviously, first things first, you put the back plate on before you put the hubs on, otherwise you can't put it on afterwards. So inserting the bearing, I used this piece here and a slightly bigger cup with a threaded bar on the other end. So with bearings you really have to treat them as two separate parts really. You've got the inner part and the outer part. So when you're inserting the bearing into the trailing arm, you should only press on the outer part and not on the inner part. So you need to pick one of these that fits perfectly. It's just slightly undersized than the bore that you're pressing it into, and then on the other end you've got to get something that's even bigger to make sure that the bearing can just slide in nicely and you're not putting any pressure on the center part of the bearing. And the same goes for when you're inserting the hub into the bearing. So once it's in, put the circlip on, then you can go ahead and attach the back plate. Again, the threaded holes are cleaned up with this tap and die set here, and then the bolts went in perfectly, torqued up fine. So then I used these cups and this threaded bar to insert the hub into the bearing. So then you're only looking at the inner part of the bearing. So if you're pressing something into the inner part, you have to support the inner part from the other end. Do not support the outer part of the bearing and press on the inner part, because then you'll just destroy the bearing. So I'll show you in a second how they fit. So you use this cup to press on there, and then you use the other cup to support the center section of the bearing. So it's got to be the same size, give or take a few millimeters, from the other side. So you're supporting it from that side and you're pressing it in from this side, and you have to press it in all the way until it's home, until it basically stops, and that's it. I've also cleaned up the bores for the wheel speed sensor, and there was a bit of powder coat left over on the bores for the ball joints, so I've cleaned them up as well, and the ball joints went in quite nicely. So it's a good idea to actually put the ball joints in before you put the back plate on, because they're slightly angled, so when you're putting the bar into them and you've got the heat shield on, you'll scratch and damage the heat shield. So I did them in the order where they went on first. After that the bearing got pressed in, after that the back plate went on, and after that the hubs went on. And this is the actual kit that I bought some years ago, with all these different sized cups, and this is a very handy tool to have in your workshop for doing work with bushings, for doing work with bearings and things like that. It becomes very, very useful. The very small bar I've already had to replace once, because you can only take so much, and I've stretched the old one, but the three bigger ones have been really, really good. So that's the kit that I used, and I highly recommend it if you're doing something like this. So the trailing arms are now on, all attached to the control arms, everything is torqued. Attached to the body, that's torqued up as well. Suspension is on, springs. I actually ended up using new lower spring seats because I had some lying around. The calipers, the pads, the anti-roll bar, the discs, the handbrake assembly. I did a video on how to assemble the handbrake, so check out the other video if you have a chance. The differential, the drive shafts, everything is torqued. The brackets for the brake caliper hoses, that's how they fit. You have the brackets there, the handbrake cables, so the handbrake cable actually goes through the exhaust heat shield brackets. The anti-roll bar with the new bushings for the anti-roll bar links on both sides. The lower control arms are now adjusted. I sort of roughly adjusted them about halfway through for the camber adjustment, just until the geometry gets done on the car next week. Once the car's on the ground, we'll torque these bolts up. That'll be the final bit. Exhaust is still to go on. I thought I'll take this video before the exhaust goes on, but exhaust and wheels can go back on and we can go for a test drive. I've also filled the diff up with this differential oil, so for helical gear LSDs, for Torsen LSDs, you just use standard open diff gear oil. So this particular oil here is by Road and Race Transmissions, 80W90 GL5 specific. They recommended it, so I'm giving it a go. Because the diff's got this back plate on it, it's actually taking just over 3 litres of fluid, so quite a lot more to what the normal back plate diff would take. So just be mindful of that if you're doing something like that. If you're changing the back plate, make sure you have the right amount of oil to go back in. Just a couple of points to mention. The drive shafts are usually very, very difficult to get back into the hubs. The left hand side went on fine, but the right hand side was a bit tight going in. So if you are going to give it a tap, just be very gentle and make sure all the splines are cleaned up. And when you are tapping in from this side, don't hit it directly. Put a cup around the outside so you're not hitting the actual little metal cover here that holds the grease in. So be mindful of that. And once they went on, we were able to torque them in and lock the nuts on the end of drive shafts, and yeah, there you go. And just assembling the anti-roll bar, one thing you should be mindful of is the upper anti-roll bar brackets have anti-rotation feature there, and that anti-rotation feature will only go on into the front hole. So if you've got your anti-roll bar bracket the wrong way around, you won't actually line up with the back hole. So make sure that's at the front when you're putting the anti-roll bar brackets back on. And finally, everything is back on the car. We have the exhaust installed, the wheels are back on, everything is nicely torqued and tightened up. You'll probably notice that we have a brand new drain plug on there, and that's a magnetic drain plug I received the other day. And the aim of that is to hopefully catch any metal debris that we might have coming off the LSD, because it's brand new. As it's wearing in, it might throw out some metal shavings. So hopefully that will catch a few things, and when we do the next differential service, we'll have a look and see whether that brings anything up. And one more point to conclude the video on, and it's to do with nuts and bolts whenever you're working with suspension components and whenever you're working with driveline components. So you must make sure that all of your bolts and all of your nuts are 100% degreased and they don't have any debris on them, because having any type of grease or lubricant on the threads of your bolts will compromise the joint integrity, and they can loosen off and they can back out, and joint slip can occur. So just make sure you 100% clean the bolts and you're happy with them when they're going in, and that everything is torqued to spec. So for example, the drive shaft bolts going into the differential flange, these bolts here, you've got to make sure that there is no grease on them whatsoever when you're doing them up, because if there is, as you're driving the car, and they're subjected, these joints are subjected to vibrations and rotation, the bolts will back out over time and you will drop the drive shaft. I've seen this happen before many times, because what happens is when you're inserting the bolt through the flange of the drive shaft into the flange and differential, the drive shaft flange itself houses grease, and there could be grease inside the bore of the drive shaft flange. So let me point to what I mean. So there is grease just inside here, and as you're putting the bolt through it, they can pick up grease, and then that grease gets transferred onto the threads, and that's where the joint torques up. So over time these bolts will just back out and the drive shaft will just drop out. So just make sure all of that is absolutely clean, 100%, and the same goes for all the suspension bolts as well, and wheel bolts for that matter. Thank you all for watching. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video and you found it useful. As always, if you have any questions, if you'd like help with anything, just drop me a message and I'll be happy to respond when I have the time. Please subscribe to the channel if you can. If you're interested in this sort of stuff, I'll be doing quite a few more videos on the progress of this E36 and the build as it's progressing. So hopefully I can bring you some more useful content in the near future. And until then, take care. Thanks again.